Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I've got my oldest bin here, which dates back to 24 weeks ago. That's 168 days. So we're only 2 weeks away from this bin reaching 6 months of age. And over the past month and a week or so, a little bit more than a month, we've been attempting to try to draw the worms out of what we had already deemed at that time to be a tub full of finished compost. So over the course of that time, we've periodically extracted worms that have come over into the feeding zone that we had set up. We've reset the feeding zone, added more food to continue encouraging that movement of the worms out of the compost. And it's been a week now since the last time we checked in on this bin. If you watched the video that I prepared of that last check-in, we did mention at that time that we were going to probably allow another couple weeks for the migration to continue, but after a week it is possible that the food that's there, or the food that was placed in there, may have been depleted or close to being depleted. So even though we thought, based on the number of worms we saw in there, that the migration might take another couple weeks, I didn't want to wait that long. I just wanted to check in to make sure that the food supply is ample and sufficient to keep that activity moving. So we're going to just make sure that there's enough food in there. If there isn't, we're going to just supplement what's in there, help that all keep moving. But on this go around, a little different from all the other resets of this feeding zone, we're not going to be extracting worms today. All we're looking to do is to make sure that we've got ample food in there. And the other thing we're going to try to do is, if need be, stir up the material in the bin to make sure that it's also drying out nicely. Because we don't want castings that are overly wet. Makes it unmanageable later when we look to harvest the container. So I'm going to get this thing up onto the bench and we'll get to work. So now, prior to coming down here, I just took a few notes off of my tracking spreadsheet just to give us some more detailed information about this bin. Like I mentioned earlier, we're at week 24, 168 days, and over that time this bin has received 14 feedings. I believe that the spreadsheet calculates that to be on average every 12 days or so. And it was 38 days ago when the bin had reached the age of 130 days. 38 days ago was when we had started into this migration. And by migration, I'm referring to the fact that we had set up only one edge of the bin over here to try to move the worms out of the finished compost. And this is the only place in the bin over the past 38 days where we've been applying food, leaving this section of the bin unfed and hopefully getting gradually depleted of food and nourishment in the hopes of encouraging the worms to exit. Not only depleted of food and nourishment, but also hopefully becoming less and less damp, which in itself would also be a reason for the worms to go looking for a more comfortable environment to be in. So over this time, there have been 4 of these horizontal feedings, and on each occasion, every time we came in here to reset, we've always hauled out the contents of this feeding zone in order to relocate the worms that had congregated into this far edge of the bin. But this go around, we're just going to leave it be, and if need be, we're going to add more food. I have a feeling that it probably will be necessary, but we're not going to be extracting worms today. It's really just a feeding and an ongoing attempt to continue luring the worms out of the compost and over into this edge of the bin. Oftentimes when you examine the bin and its feeding zone, you would normally see a drop in the level where the food had been placed, showing that the food has been consumed and that the level has dropped as a result of that, but I'm not really seeing much of that here, so it makes me wonder what to expect in here. So I'm just going to gradually start peeling back into the feeding zone to see how things look. And right off the bat, I'm sensing that there is a great deal of moisture in here. And it's the reason that we were leaving this bin uncovered the way we saw it in the beginning. Other than that little piece of paper that was trying to protect the feeding zone a little bit, the rest of the bin was just left uncovered this whole while in the hopes that the material would air out a bit and start to dry off a little. The only thing is that there's been tremendously humid weather here in central Jersey where I live over the past week. So when the air is very damp and saturated with moisture, evaporation just doesn't occur as it normally would if the air were drier. So the moisture level in here is pretty high, but it's something that the worms would probably consider as very favorable. As we start making our way down, I can already see little bits and pieces of the previous feeding, as well as some of the cardboard that had been placed in here as bedding. So here, for example, we've got a piece of a vegetable, the end of a, I don't even know what it is, something that got hacked off, but right in the middle of it you could see there's a whole bunch of worms enjoying it, eating it from the inside out. So we're going to set all these scrap bits of remaining food aside so that we can reuse them and place them back into the feeding zone. But I do believe that the food in here does look like it's been, for the most part, depleted. Stuff like this, a mango seed, it's gradually being worked down. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to manipulate it this way. Usually these things are super hard. But it's not the sort of thing that's going to break down very quickly. I just threw it in there because it was probably part of the material throughout the bin. I had collected all the larger chunks of food that I had found in the material and placed them into this feeding zone. So that's the reason that's there. But typically the feeding zone would be made up of materials that are a little bit more soft, a little easier for the worms to break down. So I'm just going to pick through here a little bit to see what we can find as far as remaining scraps of material. Mostly what I'm finding, though, as you can see, is pieces of cardboard. I don't want to remove worms from here because the whole purpose of this was to get the worms to come over to this side and to leave the rest of the material. So really I'm just going to try to remove only food bits and bedding bits that are a little bit larger, but for the most part I'm going to leave it in there. But at the same time we're just going to check out what we can see. You know what it is? It's actually a piece of bedding. It's got that shape because it's part of an egg carton. And there's a nice big fat worm in there hanging out with a bunch of slightly smaller worms. So that's pretty cool. I want to just be careful not to move a bunch of worms away from the space that we've been trying to lure them into. And now I'm reminded of how this feeding zone had been set up previously. We did have egg carton in here, and there was sort of an experimental piece of material thrown in here. It was a wad of human hair, and we had sort of abandoned tracking that as of last week, I believe. And it was placed into one of these little cups or egg carton bits, if you want to refer to it as that, into one of these little cardboard cup-like shapes. But I wouldn't be surprised if we would be unable to locate it here today, because I thought I had placed it into that corner right there. But the first thing I did was I stirred everything up and I disturbed the position of everything that was in here. So at this point it's likely that we're not going to see that glob of hair anymore. Although it would have been interesting to see how it's progressing. So a lot of these cardboard bits are still holding up pretty good. The worms are probably chewing on it and doing away with it gradually. I don't know if you can hear it, but the material definitely has a kind of a gooey, moist sound to it as I move it around. this was really the telltale of where the hair is. This was the piece of eggshell that I had placed right alongside the hair in the hopes that I'd be able to use it as a way to more easily locate it later. And it's becoming inundated with gooey stuff, castings material, and even cruising around within it you can see a worm or two, but it doesn't really strike me as being a very interesting thing that the worms are really jazzed about, especially since I give them all kinds of other much more delicious food to focus their energy on. But here you can see a fairly good sized worm exiting the glob of hair. So maybe just in the interest of making it easier for us to spot it next time, maybe I can allocate a piece of eggshell that's been set aside here for pulverization, and maybe just use that as the way to more easily locate it next time we come in here. Because I think these cardboard bits that I'd been placing it into previously are just not going to last very long. So we'll put this over there too. So I have this tray of different types of kitchen scraps. It's fruits and veggies of different types. An amount that I think will be enough to refill this feeding zone to continue spurring on the movement of the worms over into this feeding zone. But I've been trying to sequence my steps in a better way because it does make sense to verify the need for more food before adding more food. So before we move on to the next step of what I believe is going to be necessary, which is the resetting of the food in this horizontal migration zone, I'd like to check how the material is coming along from the perspective of depopulation and migration. So really quick, I'm going to put all these bits of recycled bedding that we set aside and little food scraps, just so we can rummage around out here in the material at large, which was left uncovered for the past week to try to promote evaporation and drying. And as I remember from last week, there was still a fair number of worms in this material. In fact, maybe even more worms than I had expected there to be. And usually when you've got some nice damp material like this that is still littered with all kinds of little bits of organic material, like these little stems and stuff, little leafy bits, it is fair to expect that the worms are just going to stay put and continue enjoying the moisture that's in the material and just continue feeding on the remaining food that's in the material. So there's not much we can do in terms of trying to reduce the amount of residual food that's still scattered about in here, but we can try to help the material dry off a bit. And while we're doing that, we can also attempt to extract any large bits of food or bedding we find in the material as we're rummaging around. And as you can see, the material, as we get further and further away from the feeding zone, does eventually start to look like it's a little bit more crumbly, a little bit more dry and flaky, but still a little bit more damp than one would consider finished castings to be. Most of the time when you consider a batch of castings to be done, they are dry enough that they'd be able to easily screen through a mesh so that you can try to exclude all the larger particles from it and be left with just nice rich worm castings. But this stuff would never make its way through a screen. It's just way too damp, way too sticky. So this material is definitely going to require more time to continue drying. And I think we knew that already. That's the main reason I came down here, I think, is to help agitate this material around a little bit, try to promote the drying by moving the more damp stuff up to the surface to give it exposure to the air. and move the more dry stuff that's been out on the top surface for the past week down. So this is definitely going to require a little bit more time before it starts to become a batch of castings that we can consider to be complete and ready to harvest. So we're gradually getting there. So we'll periodically check in as time goes on to try to help air out the material, help it dry. Check in on how the feeding zone is progressing to make sure it's well fed and that it continues to be a tempting spot that lures the worms out of the finished compost. And I guess we'll have to see how long it takes. It makes me wonder if by the time the bin reaches its 6 months of age, birthday, if it'll be any closer to being ready for harvest. Something tells me maybe not, just because of the amount of moisture I'm seeing in here. But I guess time will tell. So why don't we return our attention over to this side. We'll take this material that we pulled out of here, some larger food scraps as well as some remaining bedding from the previous go around. I'm just going to set it aside here briefly, as well as our little test package of hair. Kind of weird, but still something that sort of interests me. I know last week I had announced that we're just going to abandon tracking of that material, but why not? As long as we know we're going to be in and out of this bin for the next couple weeks, why not give ourselves a little something to check in on next time we come in here. So I think we'll just take our little experimental batch of human hair and place it right there in the middle. Hopefully I'll be able to sense that next time I go rummaging around in here. And then we'll just take some of these older food items that are still being worked on. Some of them might be gone soon. Some of them will probably be here for quite a while. And I think before we place in some of this old reclaimed bedding that we located, these old scraps of cardboard, I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle in a little bit of fresh bedding material. This is just some hacked up paper. Placing it in here dry in the hopes that maybe it absorbs a little bit of moisture as time goes on. Because as much as the worms need food, which is in most cases a pretty good source of nitrogen in their diet, they also need to complement that food with a carbon source too. And that's where the bedding comes in. So it's not only important from the perspective of being bedding, but it also is important from the perspective of being part of their balanced diet too. So in goes the food that they're getting today. Try to spread it out here. And you can see there's all kinds of delicious items in here, a banana peel, pieces of a peach, all kinds of stuff that I'm sure is going to get the attention of the worms and hopefully bring some of them over, more of them over. And I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of pulverized eggshell onto the fresh food too, to serve as grit for the worms. And then I'm going to start returning all of these old pieces of bedding that we had scraped out earlier. And I guess we could start bringing over the rest of the material. Now I don't want to leave this much tempting food exposed to the air because that's just asking for trouble. We're going to get a bunch of flying insects coming in to try to take advantage of that banana peel and that piece of peach over there. So I think I'm also going to grab a handful or two of crushed leaves to also cover up with over here. I'm going to try to do this carefully so I don't litter the finished compost in the bin with all kinds of leafy bits. So now hopefully that's enough to cover up the fresh fruit that's not so deep under the surface. But we'll want to cover up. So we're just going to grab this sheet of paper here. Seems to be a pretty good cover. And we can grab the piece that was already here also. Try to reduce its size a little bit to make it a better fit over our feeding zone. So once again, the paper is there to not only keep the scent of the food down, try to reduce the intrusion of pests, it's also attempting to help with the recirculation of moisture a little bit over in the feeding zone, so that while we want moisture to evaporate out of the finished castings, we're going to treat the recirculation of moisture over here in the feeding zone as an okay thing to keep happening, so that's fine over there. Although since it's paper, it's not going to do a great deal in terms of retaining moisture, but it's better than nothing. So now we're into the fifth resetting of the feeding zone over here, trying to continue the encouragement of worm migration out of the finished castings. But I think the thing that's going to help most is this material actually drying out, becoming a little bit less hospitable for the worms. And it's at that point that I think that the worms are actually going to start seeking a more damp and cozy place to be, rather than this stuff once it starts to dry out. So we're going to continue with the waiting game. And hopefully as time goes on, we'll see fewer and fewer worms out here in the finished castings. And hopefully we'll also see that the material out here starts to dry and become a little bit more manageable. So back onto the shelf with this bin, and the game continues. Alright everyone, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. I really appreciate it. Also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.